The Serpientes Cartel ruled the Sonoran borderlands with merciless precision, their empire built on a foundation of bloody retribution and 27 massacred rival gangs. From the dusty streets of Nogales to the remote mountain passes of the Sierra Madre, their name alone could empty markets and silence cantinas. But on a sweltering August night in 2024, they made a fatal miscalculation that would haunt cartel legends for generations to come. They decided to kidnap Rachel Martinez from Vista Ridge Farm. Tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale will leave you breathless. The cartel saw what they wanted to see that evening. A vulnerable target, a simple farmer's daughter tending to her horses at sunset, an easy way to pressure her father into giving up his strategic property. What they couldn't see was the truth behind James Martinez's quiet demeanor, the deadly arsenal that lay dormant behind his weathered hands. They couldn't know they were about to face the same canine units that had hunted Taliban bomb makers through the mountains of Afghanistan, the same dogs that had tracked cartel tunnels in South America for a decade. The 3 Belgian Malinois sleeping peacefully in their kennels were about to remind the Serpientes why even hardened sicarios still whispered stories about Operation Shadowhound. The late summer heat shimmered across Vista Ridge Farm's training grounds as James Martinez completed his evening routine. His movements were practiced and efficient, each step placed with the kind of awareness that comes from years of operating in hostile territory. To any observer, he appeared to be nothing more than a retired veteran turned farmer, going about his daily chores. But James never stopped watching, never stopped calculating. Through his peripheral vision, he caught the glint of rifle barrels in the mesquite brush. The third time this week, he'd spotted cartel scouts surveying his property. Different men, same snake tattoos on their necks, the Serpientes signature. They were getting bolder, more certain of their control over the borderlands. Inside the farmhouse's converted tactical room, Rachel Martinez studied satellite imagery on multiple monitors, her hands moving with practiced precision across the keyboard. At 24, she'd inherited her father's tactical mindset, along with his stubbornness. "They're back again," she said, without looking up from the thermal imaging feeds. "Same pattern as yesterday, plus a new spotter on the ridge. Amateur, keeps breaking cover to check his phone." James settled into his chair, studying the data streaming across the screens. The room looked like a standard office to visitors, but hidden panels concealed state-of-the-art surveillance equipment, a retirement gift from his old unit. "They're establishing patterns," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded Special Forces K9 teams across 3 continents. Testing our responses, mapping our routines. In their kennels, connected to the house by a covered walkway, his 3 Belgian Malinois lay alert but relaxed. Shadow, the oldest at 8 years old, had served with James through 2 tours in Afghanistan. Her daughter, Storm, had been part of DEA operations along the southern border, while the youngest, Scout, had trained specifically for cartel tunnel detection. To anyone else, they looked like well-trained farm dogs. But James knew better. He'd spent 15 years handling military working dogs, turning them into living weapons, more precise than any smart bomb. Rachel pulled up another satellite feed, her movements deliberate and controlled. "They're not just watching anymore, are they?" The question carried weight beyond her years. She'd grown up around military K9 units, understood their capabilities better than most special forces operators. More importantly, she knew her father's real history, not just as a handler, but as the architect of Operation Shadowhound, the classified program that had revolutionized military K9 tactics. James allowed himself a small smile, the same expression that had once made hardened Taliban fighters surrender rather than face what came after. No, they're preparing, building confidence, establishing what they think are our vulnerabilities. They'll make their move soon. He zoomed in on thermal images showing cartel vehicles moving along back roads. Interesting, they're using old smuggling routes, ones that haven't been active since the 90s. "We could sell," Rachel suggested, though her tone said she already knew his answer. "Their offer is well above market value, $3 million for a training farm in the middle of nowhere." "It's not about the money." James's voice carried an edge. He rarely allowed himself to show. Serpientes has bought or pressured their way into controlling every strategic property along this stretch of border. They're building something, a network of safe houses and staging areas. This farm backs up to the only unmonitored pass in 50 miles, perfect for moving things that need to stay invisible. Their conversation was interrupted by movement on the thermal feeds. A convoy of vehicles approached along the main road, not passing by this time, but turning onto their long dirt track. James moved to the window, his stance casual, but his mind calculating angles, distances, potential fields of fire. 8 men emerged from 3 black SUVs, led by a figure he recognized from intelligence briefings, Marco El Coyote Ramirez, head of Serpientes' enforcement arm, suspected of over 30 brutal executions, but never caught. "Stay in the command." "Center," James told Rachel, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once directed K-9 teams through Taliban-held valleys. "Whatever happens, whatever you hear, stay with the feeds. Be our eyes." He touched the hidden panel concealing his old tactical gear, equipment he hadn't used since retiring, but maintained with military precision. "And Rachel, if I don't give the all clear in exactly 20 minutes, I know, Dad. Signal Uncle Mike, initiate protocol echo." Her voice was steady, professional. She'd grown up running drills for exactly this scenario, understanding that her father's retirement hadn't really been his choice. The classified nature of Shadow Hound meant keeping a low profile, appearing to be nothing more than a veteran training civilian security dogs. But some skills couldn't be buried. Some instincts never died. James moved through the house with practiced efficiency, checking equipment that appeared decorative but served specific tactical purposes. The heavy wind chimes that could mask movement. Sounds. The solar lights positioned to create deliberate blind spots in night vision equipment. The reinforced door frames that could withstand breaching charges. Everything maintained, everything ready. He stepped onto the porch just as the SUVs pulled up in a practiced formation, dust billowing around their black paint. Ramirez emerged with fluid grace, though James noted how he favored his right leg. Slightly, an old injury according to intelligence reports. The cartel enforcers spread out with military precision, hands never far from their weapons. Their movement patterns suggested formal training, probably deserters from Mexican special forces. "Mr. Martinez," Ramirez called out, his voice carrying the false charm of a serpent about to strike. "Beautiful evening for business discussions, no?" His English was perfect, cultured, speaking to his rumored education at American universities before joining the cartel. "This is private property," James replied, keeping his voice neutral, maintaining the image of a simple veteran-turned-farmer. Through subtle movements of his fingers, hidden from the cartel's view, he signaled commands to his dogs. In their kennels, the 3 Malinois shifted silently into alert positions, years of training taking over. But that's exactly what I wanted to discuss." Ramirez moved forward with calculated confidence, his men adjusting positions to maintain coverage. "Property rights, opportunities, mutual benefits." He gestured expansively, taking in the farm's strategic location. "My organization has plans for this region, plans that could benefit everyone." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Including you and your lovely daughter." James watched how the enforcers tried to establish dominant positions, noting their tactical weaknesses, Amateur moves by cartel standards, but still dangerous. These weren't ordinary thugs. Their gear and movement patterns suggested military background. Through hidden cameras, he knew Rachel was documenting everything, building intelligence they'd need later. We're not interested in selling. James wrapped his arms around himself, playing the part of an intimidated farmer. This land has been in my wife's family for generations. The mention of his late wife was deliberate. Let them think he was emotionally vulnerable, easier to manipulate. Times change, Mr. Martinez. Ramirez's charm slipped, revealing something colder. Progress comes whether we want it or not. Smart folks adapt. He shrugged, letting the threat hang in the air. Others tend to get left behind, sometimes tragically. James allowed a trace of fear to show on his face, feeding their assumptions. Let them think they were dealing with a simple veteran, broken by war and loss. Let them underestimate him. It's what he'd been training them to do for weeks, watching. Them watch him, learning their patterns, their weaknesses. Are you threatening me, Mr. Ramirez? Threatening. Ramirez smiled, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocence. I'm offering you opportunity, $3 million, because I respect what you've built here. His voice hardened slightly, but that offer won't last forever. James wrapped his arms around himself, maintaining the facade of vulnerability. I'll need to discuss this with my daughter. Inside, he was cataloging weapons, analyzing stances, noting how each cartel member carried themselves. Everything confirmed his suspicions. These weren't ordinary criminals. Their quasi-military bearing suggested special forces training, probably Mexican Marines turned mercenary. Let's pause for a moment. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this kind of story, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale will leave you speechless. Of course, family is important. Ramirez produced a business card, holding it out. James stepped forward to take it, letting them see his slight tremor. Through hidden cameras, he knew Rachel was documenting everything, building the intelligence they'd need later. The card was expensive, embossed with gold leaf. Another sign that Serpientes was no ordinary cartel. They were evolving, becoming more sophisticated. 3 days, Mr. Martinez, Ramirez said as he mounted up. Then we'll need an answer. The SUVs thundered away in a cloud of dust, leaving James on the porch. He waited until they were out of sight before his demeanor changed completely. The trembling stopped, his posture shifted subtly, weight perfectly balanced. This was the stance that had made him legendary in special operations, the handler preparing to unleash his weapons. Inside the command center, Rachel was already analyzing footage. 7 of them had Mexican Marine tattoos, she reported. The other 2 showed Guatemalan Special Forces training patterns. They're building a private army, and they're getting ready to move on something big, James replied, studying thermal imaging of the departing vehicles. Something worth killing for. He turned to his daughter, letting her see the steel beneath his quiet smile. They just invited the wrong dogs to their party. The town of Mesa Verde hadn't changed much in the 5 years since James Martinez had chosen it for his retirement. The single dusty main street still housed the same family businesses, though now most sported security cameras and paid protection money to the Serpientes Cartel, silent testimony to how far the border region had fallen. James guided his truck past the Cantina Vieja, noting 3 cartel vehicles clustered near the entrance. Inside, raised voices carried through open windows. Garcia's feed store had been in the family for 3 generations. Now it was about to become another kind of lesson. 2 cartel members flanked the counter where Elena Garcia stood, her face pale but determined. The third, wearing tactical gear with professional precision, leaned forward menacingly. James recognized him from intelligence briefings. Miguel El Lobo Torres, Ramirez's chief enforcer. Protection payments are going up, Torres growled. Territory's changing. Be a shame if something happened to this nice place. James selected items from the shelves, moving quietly through the store. His presence registered. He saw the nearest cartel member's hand twitch slightly toward his holster. Ex-military for sure, that telltale gesture. More evidence, something. Bigger was happening with Serpientes. I've already paid this month. Elena's voice carried clearly. Sheriff Dawson says, Sheriff ain't in charge anymore. Torres swept a display of feed samples onto the floor. We are, 2,000 a week starting today. James rounded the aisle, his cart filled with normal farm supplies. He kept his movements deliberate, unthreatening. Just another local farmer doing his shopping. Oh my, he said mildly, stepping around the scattered feed. What a mess. Elena, do you have a broom? I'd be happy to help clean up. The cartel members turned, irritation crossing their faces. Torres started to speak, but James was already moving past them to the counter, pulling out his wallet. Add these to my monthly account, he said cheerfully, and I'll need that new supplement you got in, the one from California. Tom at the horse ranch says it's amazing. Elena blinked, then caught on. Of course, James, I'll get that from the back. Take your time. James smiled at the cartel members. I'm sure these gentlemen were just leaving, weren't they, boys? Torres stepped closer, trying to use his bulk to intimidate. This ain't your business, old man. No? James's smile remained pleasant, but his eyes changed subtly. Later, Torres would try to explain to his companions what he saw in those eyes. Something cold, something that triggered instincts he'd learned in worse places than this. My father helped build this town. Elena's grandfather gave me my first job after I came back from Afghanistan. So maybe it is my business. He turned back to his shopping list, dismissing them. The insult was deliberate, calculated. Torres's face reddened, his hand twitching toward his weapon. You should be careful, Mr. Martinez, he growled. Accidents happen. Yes, they do. James didn't look up from his list. Like last week when your boys tried to move product through Shadow Canyon, the one that wasn't reported. Now he met Torres's eyes. Funny thing about accidents, you never know who might be watching, or what might be watching. The cartel members exchanged glances. That operation hadn't been reported because it happened during a midnight smuggling run. No one was supposed to know about it. We'll finish this later, Torres told Elena, trying to salvage some authority, but his voice had lost its edge. After they left, Elena sagged against the counter. Thank you, James, but you shouldn't have. They're dangerous. Yes, they are. James began cleaning up the scattered feed. And they're getting more organized. That's what worries me. Elena retrieved a broom. Sheriff Dawson says they're just passing through, part of some big land acquisition deal. Is that what he says? James's voice was carefully neutral. Interesting, because that's not what his deputy told Maria Rodriguez when they tried to pressure her into selling last month. He worked in silence for a moment, letting Elena process the implications. The store owner was smart. She'd see the pattern. They're buying up all the strategic properties along the border, Elena said slowly, or forcing people to sell. But why? It's just ranch country. Maybe. James finished stacking the feed bags. But it's also the most direct route between major cartel territories. Lots of empty land, no border patrol sensors in some spots. Perfect for moving things that need to stay invisible. Elena's eyes widened. You think I think, James interrupted gently, that you should take a vacation. Visit your sister in Phoenix, just for a week or two. I can't. The store. James's voice was soft, but carried absolute authority. Please. Things are about to change in Mesa Verde. When they do, it's better if certain people aren't around to see it. Outside, James loaded his supplies into the truck, his hand brushing against the hidden compartment he'd installed, the one concealing his old tactical gear, equipment from his Shadowhound days that most people didn't even know existed. A rider approached from the direction of the farm, Rachel looking worried. "The thermal feeds picked up movement after you left," she said quietly. "More cartel vehicles arriving at their compound. Something's happening." James smiled slightly. The pieces were moving exactly as he'd predicted. Serpientes was getting nervous, pushing harder, which meant they had a deadline. Something big was coming. He guided the truck to the outskirts of town, pulling onto a rise overlooking the border country. From here, he could see the long stretch of territory Serpientes had been acquiring piece by piece. 5 years ago, he'd been investigating a major cartel trafficking operation that used legitimate businesses as cover. The trail had led to this region before his superiors suddenly shut him down, forced him into early retirement. Now, Serpientes was buying up land along the same route, using the same tactics. His hand brushed the truck's hidden compartment again, feeling the familiar weight of his tactical gear. Some skills you never forgot, some instincts never died. The legend they called the Ghost Handler was about to come out of retirement, and Serpientes was about to learn why hardened cartel soldiers still woke up screaming at the memory of Shadowhound operations. But first, he had to give them exactly what they wanted. One seemingly vulnerable veteran, ready to be pressured into selling his strategic property. The perfect target, the perfect trap. James smiled as he drove home. Some predators, after all, hunt best from inside the den, and his dogs had been waiting far too long for a real mission. Dr. Sarah Chen's clinic sat on the edge of Mesa Verde, a modern medical facility built with old ranching money. As James guided his truck into the parking lot, he noted 3 black SUVs with darkened windows. Their custom suspension and reinforced bumpers caught his practiced eye, cartel vehicles modified for tactical operations. Inside, he found Sarah in her office reviewing patient records with shaking hands. The circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "Mr. Martinez," she said, closing her ledger quickly, "your monthly delivery of medical supplies isn't due until next week." "The new security doors are impressive, Sarah," James observed, settling into a chair. His eyes tracked the subtle changes in the clinic. Reinforced windows, newly installed locks, a shotgun barely visible behind the desk. "Expecting trouble?" Sarah glanced at her office door before speaking softly. 4 Serpientes enforcers came in last night. Gunshot wounds. Said it was a hunting accident. She ran a hand through her graying hair. "Thing is, the wounds were from military-grade weapons. Clean shots through and through, calculated to disable without killing." James kept his expression neutral, but his mind was working. Professional hits, sending messages. "Hunting accident. That's what Sheriff Dawson's report says." Sarah leaned forward. "But I saw the damage, James. These weren't random shots. Someone sending messages, someone who knows exactly what they're doing. And now, Serpientes is demanding something from you," James observed quietly. Before Sarah could respond, boots thundered down the hallway. Torres burst in with 2 more cartel members, the same ones from Garcia's store. The larger one jabbed a finger at Sarah. "Those records you were looking at, hand them over now." James remained seated, seemingly forgotten in the corner. He watched Sarah stand, noting how her hand moved toward her desk drawer. Ex-army medic. She'd have a weapon within reach. "Patient records are confidential," Sarah said firmly. "You know that." The second enforcer drew his pistol. Amateur move, threatening instead of acting. James catalogued his weaknesses automatically. Weight, too far forward. Grip too tight, eyes focusing on his target instead of scanning for other threats. "Confidential doesn't apply anymore, Doc," Torres growled. "Boss wants those records, and what the boss wants..." "And what exactly does your boss want with private medical records?" James's voice cut through the tension. He hadn't moved from his chair, but something in his tone made all 3 cartel members turn. "Stay out of this, Martinez," the armed one warned. "This ain't your business." "Actually," James smiled slightly, Tell me something. Did Ramirez send you for all of Dr. Chen's records, or just the ones about last night's hunting accident? The enforcers exchanged glances. The larger one stepped toward him. You need to leave, now. Or what? James rose smoothly, his movement making both men instinctively step back. You'll have another accident like those 4 men who got shot, the ones hit with military-grade weapons from exactly 300 meters? His smile was predatory. That's an interesting range. Very precise. Almost like someone was sending a message. Torres's hand dropped to his gun. How did you... The same way I know about the weapons cache in Shadow Canyon. James's voice turned cold. The same way I know about the land acquisition strategy. The same way I know about the deal with the corrupt Border Patrol officers. All 3 men went pale. That information was compartmentalized. Nobody outside Ramirez's inner circle should know about it. Who are you? The larger one demanded. Just a retired veteran. James moved toward the door, his stride casual, but his path taking him inside their reaction zones. For now. But you tell Ramirez something's changed in his operation. Someone's watching. Someone who knows how to look. He paused at the door. Oh, and boys, next time you pull a gun in a doctor's office, he nodded toward Sarah's desk, check if your target is the only one armed. After he left, the enforcers found Sarah calmly holding a Sig Sauer under her desk. They left without the records. James drove home along the border trail, his mind processing the encounter. The enforcers' reactions confirmed his suspicions. Serpientes was running professional operations, using the clinic to treat any casualties that occurred. But the operation was bigger than just drug running. The land grabs, the border patrol connections, the military-grade weapons, it all pointed to something larger. His hand brushed the truck's hidden compartment again, feeling the reassuring presence of his tactical gear. The equipment that had made him legendary, that had ended the careers of dozens of cartel operators who thought they were untouchable. 5 years ago, he'd walked away from that life, thinking he could find peace in a small border town with his daughter and his dogs. But some legends don't get to retire. Some skills don't fade with time, and some fights find you no matter how far you run. He found Rachel on the porch, monitoring their surveillance feeds. They followed you from town, she said quietly. 3 vehicles keeping their distance, using parallel roads to avoid detection. They're getting bolder. James studied the thermal images where heat signatures marked the watchers' positions. Ramirez's organization is moving something big, something worth killing for. That case you were working on, Rachel spoke carefully. The one that got shut down. The cartel trafficking operation that got buried because you got too close to someone powerful. James's eyes hardened. Someone who didn't want their connection to international weapons trafficking exposed. Now the same operation has surfaced here, using the same routes, the same tactics. He pulled out a secure phone he'd received that morning, showing Rachel the encrypted message. The text was brief. Old patterns matching Durango case. Watch your 6. Mike, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. Rachel recognized the initial. Your old commander from Shadowhound. James nodded. The pieces are falling into place. By this time tomorrow, Serpientes will make their move. They'll try to use you as leverage to force me to sell the farm. His voice carried absolute certainty. And that's when the dogs come out of retirement. That's when we finish what started in Durango. As darkness fell, James made his preparations. Hidden caches of tactical gear, emergency supplies, specialized K9 equipment, everything a ghost handler needed to hunt, because James Martinez hadn't spent the last 5 years just playing farmer. He'd been waiting, planning, watching for the operation to resurface. Now Serpientes had given him the perfect opportunity. All he had to do was let them think they were the predators. Night settled over Vista Ridge Farm like a tactical shroud. James sat in darkness, watching through his thermal optics as cartel vehicles took positions in the mesquite thickets. Their movement patterns confirmed his suspicions. These weren't ordinary criminals. They moved with military precision, using standard Mexican Marine approaches. A secure message arrived just before sunset, carried by a young man James knew worked for Mitchell. The text was brief but telling. Facial recognition confirms 5 of Ramirez's new men were with GAIF Special Forces, same unit that disappeared in Durango. Watch the shadows. James smiled in the darkness as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The same unit that had provided security for the weapons shipment he'd been investigating before being forced to retire. Now they were here, working with Serpientes. His hand touched the hidden panel, concealing his tactical gear. "They're here," he said softly. "Last chance to do this differently." Rachel's voice came from the darkness behind him. "No." James checked his equipment, mentally preparing his dogs for what was coming. "They need to think they have control, need to get inside their operation." He touched his daughter's hand briefly. "Remember the signal. If I don't send an all-clear every 6 hours..." "I know, Dad. Contact Uncle Mike. Initiate protocol Echo." Rachel's voice was tight with concern. "Just come back to me." "Always." The first flashbang crashed through the front window, exactly where James had predicted. The tactical team breached with professional efficiency, dual teams, coordinated movement, synchronized timing. In another life, he would have commended their technique. These weren't random cartel thugs. This was military training in action. James let them find him in the kitchen, appearing appropriately terrified. The team leader, face hidden behind a tactical mask, zip-tied his hands with practiced ease. "Target secured," he reported to someone. "Outside." No complications. They moved him quickly to the waiting vehicles. Through his carefully crafted mask of fear, James noted every detail. 8-man team, latest military gear, Mexican Marine hand signals. This was no ordinary cartel operation. Ramirez waited by the SUVs, watching with satisfaction. "Mr. Martinez," he said smoothly. "Sorry about the dramatic entrance, but we needed to make a point." James let his voice tremble. "What do you want?" "Same. A thing as before, the property rights. But now your daughter has extra motivation to sell." Ramirez's smile didn't reach his eyes. "She'll be our guest until the paperwork is signed." The drive to their compound took exactly 22 minutes. James counted every turn, noted every signal. The tactical team maintained strict communications discipline. Another sign they weren't typical cartel thugs. Inside the abandoned desert, Springs Resort, the setup confirmed his analysis. Professional guard positions, modern equipment, secure communications. This wasn't just a temporary holding site. This was an operations base. They secured him to a chair in what had once been the resort's main lobby, giving him a clear view of their activities. Overconfidence. They wanted him to see their strength, their professionalism, to feel helpless. "Don't worry, this won't take long." Ramirez pulled up a chair. "Your daughter has already received our demands. Once she signs the transfer papers, you'll be free to go." Through the lobby's high windows, James could see teams unloading crates from a newly arrived truck. Military shipping containers, serial numbers matching the pattern from Durango. "Why?" he asked, letting tears fill his eyes. "Why our farm? There's nothing special about that land." "Actually, there is." Ramirez leaned back, enjoying his moment of superiority. "The border's about to become very important. Certain business opportunities are opening up. Your farm's location is the final piece we need." A commotion at the loading dock drew his attention. One of the tactical team members approached rapidly. "Sir, we've got a problem. The shipment manifests don't match. Someone's been tampering with the routing codes." Ramirez's casual demeanor vanished. "Show me." James watched them examine documents at a nearby table. The tactical team member pointed to something on a manifest. These serial numbers, they're being tracked. Someone's monitoring the shipments. Impossible. Ramirez's voice carried real concern now. Those codes are classified military only. Not anymore. The team member lowered his voice, but James's trained hearing caught every word. Boss, this matches what happened in Durango. Remember when that ghost handler almost exposed the whole operation? James kept his expression fearful, but inside he smiled. They'd taken him exactly where he needed to be, at the heart of their operation. His fingers worked silently at the zip ties, using techniques learned from years of covert operations. The same skills that had helped him escape 3 captive situations during his Shadowhound days. Ramirez returned, his earlier confidence replaced by barely concealed worry. Change of plans. We accelerate the timeline. Get the buyer on secure. Channels. The whole shipment moves tonight. Sir, one of his men objected, the border crossing isn't secured yet. Now. Ramirez ran a hand through his hair. Something's wrong. This is too similar to Durango. We need to finish this before... He stopped, staring at James with dawning suspicion. For just a moment, James let his mask slip, let him see what was really behind his tears. Ramirez took an involuntary step back. "Who are you?" he whispered. James smiled, and for the first time that night it reached his eyes. The same smile that had haunted cartel nightmares for years. "You should have checked more carefully," he said softly. "Should have looked deeper into who you were dealing with." But then the weapons traffickers in Durango made the same mistake. Ramirez's face went pale. "The ghost handler. You're the ghost handler." Around them, his tactical team shifted uneasily. Even years later, that name carried weight in certain circles. James saw fingers tightening on triggers, eyes darting toward exits. The legend was still alive, still powerful. "Consider this a friendly warning," James continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once made cartel soldiers surrender rather than face his canine units. "Release me now. Leave Arizona, and this ends here. Continue with tonight's shipment." He shrugged against his loosening bonds. "Well, you know what happened in Durango." Ramirez's response was predictable, born of desperation and fear. "Secure him. Double the guard. No one goes in or out without my direct approval." He leaned close to James, trying to mask his uncertainty with bravado. "Legend or not, you're not stopping this shipment. Too much money involved, too many powerful people." "I know," James replied calmly. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." As they left him alone in the lobby, James began counting down in his head. 2 hours until Rachel initiated Protocol Echo. 1 hour until Mitchell's team would be in position. Just enough time for a legend to prepare for hunting. The old resort hummed with tense activity as James observed from his secured position. Through the high windows, he watched Ramirez's operation with professional interest. 3 shifts of guards rotating every 2 hours, communications center monitoring radio frequencies, tactical teams maintaining perimeter security. Professional, but not flawless. A younger guard approached, holding a water bottle. His Marine, core tattoo, identified him as Rodriguez, according to the name scratched on his tactical vest. Former military based on his bearing, but his eyes showed uncertainty. "Thank you, Rodriguez." James's use of his name made him start slightly. "First Marine Division, right? Camp Pendleton." His expression confirmed James's analysis. "How did you... the way you move, that distinct Marine Corps scanning pattern." He took a sip of water. "Tell me, what did they tell you about tonight's shipment? I'm not supposed to talk to you." "Of course not." James's voice carried just enough edge to make him nervous. "But already having doubts, aren't you? Wondering why a simple land grab needs military-grade tactical teams? Why those crates have artillery stamps?" Rodriguez glanced involuntarily at the loading area where teams were preparing the shipment. James noted the reaction. artillery stamps, another piece of the puzzle. Those weren't just rifles they were moving. Those aren't just weapon shipments. He continued softly. You've figured that out, haven't you? Regular guns don't need specialized handling protocols, don't need military security teams. Shut up. But his voice lacked conviction. Did Ramirez tell you about Durango? About what happened to the last team that helped move cargo like this? A door slammed open as Ramirez entered, his face tight with controlled anger. Stop talking to the prisoner. He dismissed Rodriguez with a gesture, then turned to James. Turning my men already? You haven't lost your touch. Just making conversation, James smiled pleasantly. Reminiscing about old times. Remember Captain Valdez from Durango? The one who helped us expose the operation? He got full immunity. Ramirez's facade cracked slightly. You're not getting out of this. Even if you are the ghost handler, you're alone. No tactical support, no K9 units. Am I? James shifted slightly, making him tense. Are you sure about that? Before he could respond, one of his communications specialists burst in. Boss, we've got movement. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south. Buyers are early, not the buyers. The specialist's voice carried real concern. Different approach pattern. Professional. They're maintaining radio silence. James watched Ramirez's expression shift. Expecting someone else? He asked innocently. His hand trembled slightly as he read a new message from their communications center. How? This is impossible. Those are classified military frequencies. Are they? James kept his voice casual. You should ask your weapons buyers about their operational security, particularly their communications protocols. Sloppy work. Using the same frequencies as Durango, Ramirez grabbed his chair, leaning close. What did you do? Me, I'm just a hostage. But his smile suggested otherwise, although you might want to check your vehicles for tracking markers, standard procedure during a kidnapping, plant trackers during the initial encounter. Your tactical team was so focused on looking professional, they forgot basic counter-surveillance. A new commotion erupted outside. One of the tactical team leaders rushed in. Sir, we've got a problem. Radio chatter just lit up. Multiple K9 units coordinating with DEA patrols. They're establishing blockades on all approaches to the border. Shut it down, Ramirez ordered. Scrub everything. Tell the buyers, too late. James's voice cut through his growing panic. Those blockades aren't random. They're boxing you in, using your own tactical approach against you. Standard Shadowhound protocol. Trap them in their own fortress. Ramirez's communications operator brought another message. The paper made him curse. The buyers are backing out. Say there's too much heat. Of course they are. James settled more comfortably in his chair. Professional weapons buyers don't like complications. One hint of K9 units and they disappear, taking their money with them. Through the windows, he could see the operation unraveling. Guards abandoning positions, tactical teams arguing about evacuation protocols, the professional facade cracking under pressure. You planned this, Ramirez accused. The kidnapping, the tracking markers, the buyers getting spooked. You wanted to be caught. Partly true. James met his gaze calmly. I needed to confirm the connection to Durango. Needed to identify the real players, Ramirez, the ones above you, the ones who shut down my investigation 5 years ago. A new voice crackled through their radio. Mitchell's distinctive tone. Attention, Serpientes. This is a federal operation. We have you surrounded. All exits are covered. Surrender now. James watched the last of Ramirez's confidence crumble. You think you've won? You think exposing this operation changes anything? There will always be men like you. James's voice could have frozen desert sand. Men who think their connections, their tactical training, their cartel power puts them above the law. His smile was terrifying in its calm. That's why legends exist, Ramirez. to remind everyone that justice comes for all men, eventually. The resort erupted in chaos as Serpientes members realized the trap they were in. Some wanted to fight, others were already looking for escape routes. The professional tactical team stood apart, communicating urgently on their secure channels. "One last chance, Ramirez." James's voice carried absolute certainty. "Surrender now. Tell us everything about the buyers, about the artillery shipments, about Durango, or..." He shrugged. "Well, you remember what happened to the last organization that underestimated the ghost handler?" Ramirez stared at him for a long moment, weighing options that were rapidly disappearing. Outside, K9 teams could be seen taking positions. The net was closing. The legend was hunting again, and this time he had them exactly where he wanted them. The old resort had become a pressure cooker, and Ramirez was about to learn why some legends never truly retire. The resort erupted in chaos as James watched Ramirez's organization fracture under pressure. The professional tactical teams had separated themselves from the regular Serpientes members, their military training obvious as they established defensive positions. Rodriguez approached Ramirez nervously. "Sir, the artillery markings on those..." "Your crates," he said, voice wavering. "What exactly are we moving here? Shut up and maintain your position," Ramirez snapped, but James caught the fear beneath his anger. The operation was unraveling faster than he could control. "Tell him, Ramirez," James suggested calmly from his chair. "Tell him about the field artillery pieces, the ones broken down into components, the ones your buyers are willing to pay gold bars for." I said, "Shut up." Ramirez drew his pistol, but his hand shook slightly. The tactical team leader stepped forward. "Boss, we need to make a decision. K9 units are moving into position, at least 3 different approaches. They're following Ghost Protocol. Multiple units, synchronized approach." James explained helpfully. "The same technique I developed in Durango." He smiled at Ramirez. "Remember how that ended? Half the organization tried to surrender, hoping for deals. The other half, well, undertakers in 3 states got very busy." Rodriguez moved closer to James, his voice low. "What happened in Durango?" Before Ramirez could stop him, James's voice cut through his command. "International weapons trafficking. Military-grade artillery being sold to foreign buyers. Sound familiar?" He watched Rodriguez's face as realization dawned. Just like now. Same buyers, same protocols, even the same artillery stamps on the crates. The tactical team leader cursed softly. "Those aren't just weapons parts in those containers, are they? We're moving complete artillery batteries." The resort erupted in angry shouts as more Serpientes members overheard. Regular cartel soldiers had signed up for drug running and intimidation, not international weapons trafficking. "You're enjoying this," Ramirez accused, his face pale with rage. "Immensely," James shifted in his chair, making his guards tense. "Watch your men, Ramirez. See how they're dividing. Military-trained personnel by the exits, regular members clustering together. They're choosing sides, just like Durango." An explosion rocked the perimeter as Mitchell's team detonated their first warning shot. Not penetrating yet, just demonstrating. Their position: classic Ghost Protocol, psychological pressure before physical assault. "Boss," a communications specialist called from his position. "Radio frequencies are being jammed, all channels going dark." "Tell me, Ramirez," James's voice carried through the growing chaos. "Did your buyers mention what happens to failed operators? Because I remember files full of accidents and disappearances, more explosions outside." Mitchell's voice boomed through. A megaphone. "Attention all personnel. We have confirmation of artillery pieces on site. This is now a federal operation. Surrender immediately, or we will use lethal force." The effect was immediate. Regular Serpientes members began throwing down weapons. The professional tactical teams established a defensive perimeter, but James could see the uncertainty in their movements. "Artillery pieces?" Rodriguez whispered, horrified. "We've been moving artillery pieces?" "Not your fault," James told him, quietly. "They pick ex-military carefully, men who follow orders, don't ask questions until it's too late." Ramirez's communications operator brought another message. His face went ashen white as he read it. "No, they can't. They promised." "Let me guess," James said pleasantly. "Your buyers just officially disavowed all connection to this operation. Standard protocol when a shipment is compromised. Right now, they're erasing records, eliminating links. Soon they'll start eliminating witnesses." The tactical team leader grabbed Ramirez's arm. "Is he right? Are they going to burn us?" "Nobody's burning anybody." Ramirez shoved him away. "We stick to protocol, destroy the evidence, eliminate witnesses, break contact." His eyes fixed on James. "Including him." "Including me?" James's voice turned cold. "You want to add killing the ghost handler to artillery trafficking charges? That's ambitious even for you." Another explosion, closer now. Through the windows, James could see K9 teams moving into position. The resort had become a trap, just as he'd planned. "Options, boss?" The tactical team leader's voice carried military precision, but also fear. "We're running out of time." James watched Ramirez wrestle with his diminishing choices. Outside, more Serpientes members were surrendering. The professional teams were separating into smaller groups, some clearly planning to fight while others prepared to run. 5 years, James said softly. 5 years I waited for this operation to resurface, for the real players to show themselves, and you led me right to them. Ramirez's radio clicked again. This time reading the message made him stumble, backward, true terror crossing his face. "They're here," he whispered. James's smile widened. "The buyers? Good. I was hoping they'd come personally." He shifted again, making the zip ties creak. After all, a legend can't hunt what it can't see. Until now. 3 black helicopters approached the resort's rear entrance, their military-style formation catching the searchlights. James counted 12 men emerging, private military contractors based on their movement pattern. Their leader wore an expensive suit that didn't quite hide his Marine Corps bearing. "Colonel Richards," James said softly, recognizing the weapons. "Buyer from his Durango files. Still hiding behind that military commission, I see." Ramirez spun to face him. "You know him?" "Of course. He was the one who ordered the Durango operation shut down, called in favors, had my investigation buried." James's smile turned predatory. "Been waiting a long time to meet him properly." Richards entered with the confident stride of someone used to owning every room. His security team spread out efficiently, assuming control of key positions from Serpientes members. "Mr. Ramirez," Richards's cultured voice carried clear authority. "You assured me this facility was secure." "It is," Ramirez started, but Richards, cut him off. "Really? Then explain the K9 teams outside. Explain how our secure frequencies were compromised." His eyes found James. "Explain why you're holding the ghost handler in your resort." The name hit the room like a thunderbolt. James saw fingers tightening on triggers, eyes darting toward exits. The legend was still alive, still powerful, and now it was hunting again. Richards transformed the tension in the old resort. Where before there had been chaos, now there was military discipline as his personal guard took control of key positions. James watched them with professional interest, noting their practiced efficiency. These weren't mere hired guns. These were experienced operators who'd chosen to follow Richards into darker ventures. Ghost handler. Richards approached James's chair with measured steps. "I must admit, I hoped never to hear that name again. You caused quite a stir in Durango. 3 dead officers, 15 arrested, an entire weapons operation exposed." He studied James with cold calculation. "All because one handler couldn't leave well enough alone. Funny thing about justice, Colonel. James's voice carried quiet authority. "It doesn't leave well enough alone. It waits, it watches, and when the time is right..." He smiled, the expression making several of Richard's men shift uneasily. "It strikes." Ramirez stepped forward, trying to salvage some control of the situation. "Colonel, I can explain..." "Can you?" Richards's tone could have frozen desert sand. "Explain how the ghost handler infiltrated your operation? Explain how he managed to alert federal K-9 units? Or perhaps you'd like to explain why my buyers are now refusing to complete the transaction." Through the resort's windows, James could see more K-9 teams taking position. Mitchell was following his protocol perfectly. Systematic containment, multiple layers of coverage. He'd developed these tactics during his active service, earning his reputation one operation at a time. "The artillery pieces," Rodriguez spoke up, earning sharp looks from Richards's men. "They're not just for border operations, are they? They're meant for something bigger." "Perceptive," James nodded approval. "Tell them, Colonel. Tell them about the uprising you're supplying. The one that's supposed to start along the Mexican border next month." Richard's composure cracked slightly. "How did you..." "The same way I know about the gold shipments from Tijuana. The same way I know about the compromised Border Patrol officers at Station 211. James's voice carried absolute certainty. 5 years is a long time to watch and wait, Colonel. Long enough to uncover every secret, trace every connection, identify every conspirator." One of Richards's lieutenants approached, speaking in low tones. "Sir, K-9 units are establishing attack positions. They're using the ghost handler's containment protocols, the ones from Operation Black Sand." "Of course they are." James shifted. In his chair, the zip ties now hanging loose, though he maintained the pretense of being bound. "Mitchell learned from the best. We spent years perfecting those techniques." Ramirez's desperation finally boiled over. "Kill him! Kill him now before..." Richards's backhand knocked him to the ground. "Fool! If we harm him now, every federal K-9 unit in 3 states will hunt us to the ends of the earth. The ghost handler isn't just a legend, he's a symbol. Kill him and we create a martyr." "Then what's your plan?" the tactical team leader demanded. "K-9 teams outside, radio frequencies jammed, buyers pulling out. We're trapped." "No one is trapped." Richards's voice carried practiced command. "Initiate Protocol 7. Destroy the artillery, eliminate evidence, create confusion. We've handled situations like this before." James's laugh made them all turn. "Protocol 7? Just like Durango." He shook his head. "Check your ammunition, Colonel. Check it very carefully." Richard's eyes narrowed. "What have you done?" "Me? Nothing." James's smile was predatory. "But it's amazing what a few well-placed friends can accomplish. Quartermasters can be very cooperative when they learn they're supplying weapons for treason." The resort erupted in new activity as Richards's men checked their weapons. James watched realization spread across their faces. Their ammunition had been replaced. The rounds looked perfect, but they were just elaborate dummies, masterfully crafted to appear real while being completely useless. "Impossible," Richards whispered. "The ammunition came directly from Station 211 secured storage." "Amazing how many doors open when you flash a federal badge." James's voice carried satisfaction. "Every round you're carrying, every shell for those artillery pieces, all of it's worthless. Has been since it left the station." Outside Mitchell's voice boomed again. "Colonel Richards, by order of the United States government, you are hereby ordered to surrender. We have documented evidence of your conspiracy, signed confessions from your conspirators at Station 211, and complete records of your weapons trafficking operation." James watched Richards's military bearing crack slightly. "Interesting thing about corrupt officers, Colonel. They're loyal, right up until they realize they're facing a firing squad. Then they become remarkably cooperative." Through the windows, they could see more K-9 teams arriving. The resort was completely surrounded, multiple layers of containment. Just as James had planned, Richard's men exchanged uncertain glances. Professional operators knew when a position was untenable. 5 years, James said softly. 5 years of watching, waiting, gathering evidence, building a case so strong that not even your political connections could bury it. And you walked right into it, just like I knew you would. The uprising. Richard's voice carried dawning horror. The border operation never existed. James's smile was cold. Just an elaborate tale fed to your informants. The perfect bait to draw you out of hiding, to make you risk moving your artillery pieces where we could intercept them. Ramirez staggered to his feet. You used us, used Serpientes as bait. No, James corrected. I used your greed, your ambition. Knew that if Richards offered you a piece of his operation, you'd jump at it without asking too many questions. He nodded toward the surrounding K9 teams. Just like I knew the colonel's ego wouldn't let him send subordinates to handle a compromised shipment. He had to come himself, had to show his authority. The resort fell silent as his words sank in. Every man there realized they'd been masterfully played, led step by step into a trap, years in the making. James's legend had grown from his K9 handling skills, but his true weapon had always been his mind. His ability to see 10 moves ahead, to turn his opponent's strengths into weaknesses. Your choice is simple, Colonel, he said quietly. Surrender. Now, provide evidence against your entire operation. Face justice in a military court. Or, he shrugged, the zip ties falling away as he finally dropped all pretense. Find out why they still whisper stories about the ghost handler around Marine Corps campfires. Richard stared at James for a long moment, weighing options that were rapidly disappearing. Outside, more K9 teams arrived by the minute. The net was closing, the trap was sprung, and the legend of the ghost handler was about to add another chapter to its already fearsome reputation. Richards's response came with military precision, a testament to his years of command experience. Secure all exits, he ordered, his voice carrying calm authority even as the situation deteriorated. Establish defensive positions. Prepare for Protocol 8. James watched his men move with practiced efficiency, but he saw what Richards missed. The subtle signs of uncertainty, the quick glances between operators who recognized a losing position. These were professional military men, trained to assess tactical situations objectively. They knew they were trapped. Protocol 8 won't help you, Colonel, James said quietly, just like it didn't help in Durango. Sir, his lieutenant reported urgently. K9 teams are in position on all approaches. They're using interlocking attack patterns, our standard. Marine Corps tactics. Of course they are. James's voice carried satisfaction. Who do you think wrote the Corps' K9 tactical manual after Afghanistan? Every defensive position you're taking, every escape route you're considering, I designed. Those protocols. Through the resort's windows, they could see the sun beginning to rise, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. James had chosen the timing carefully. Dawn light would blind anyone trying to shoot from inside the resort, while giving the K9 teams clear visibility of any movement. Ramirez's desperation finally overwhelmed his judgment. He drew his pistol, attempting to use James as leverage. Back off, or James's movement was almost too fast to follow, a blur of practiced efficiency that had made him legendary in a dozen operations. Before Ramirez could finish his threat, his gun arm was twisted behind him, his own weapon pressed against his neck. The zip ties that had seemingly held James lay discarded on the floor. 5 years doesn't dull certain skills, James said calmly, using Ramirez as a shield while surveying. The room, every gun was drawn now, creating a web of potential crossfire. Though I admit these days, I prefer to plan rather than fight. Richards's tactical assessment was immediate. Stand down, he ordered his men. He's faster than he was in Durango. You noticed. James's smile was cold. Amazing what regular practice can do. Even a retired legend needs hobbies. Rodriguez stared in fascination. The stories about Operation Black Sand, about taking down 15 cartel operators in 90 seconds. 16, James corrected. Everyone forgets the sniper in the guard tower, though in fairness, he forgot about checking his 6'2". He adjusted his grip on Ramirez, who had wisely stopped struggling. But that was luck and youthful reflexes. These days, I prefer to win before the first shot, like now. Richard's voice carried grudging admiration. 5 years of planning, positioning, gathering evidence, using Serpientes to flush us out, compromising our ammunition, coordinating with federal units. A masterpiece of strategic patience. Almost correct. James nodded toward the windows, where more K9 positions were becoming visible in the growing light. But you're missing the bigger picture. This isn't just about catching you, Colonel. It's about exposing everything. The weapons, trafficking, the corrupted officers, the political connections that helped bury the Durango investigation. The resort fell silent as his words sank in. Every man there realized the true scope of his operation. This wasn't just about capturing criminals. It was about dismantling an entire system of corruption that reached from the border to Washington. Sir, Richard's communications officer approached with a radio transcript. Message from Station 211. Federal investigators have arrived. They're seizing documents, arresting officers. The dominoes are falling, Colonel, James said quietly. Right now, similar scenes are playing out at every station, every office, every bank that helped facilitate your operation. 5 years of evidence, all released simultaneously. No one to bury the investigation this time. Richard's military bearing finally cracked. You understand what you're doing? The chaos this will cause? The careers that will be destroyed? The corrupt careers that should be destroyed, James corrected. The systems of power that allowed men like you to sell American artillery to the highest bidder, to treat the border as your private empire. A new voice boomed from outside. Mitchell, closer now. Colonel Richards, we have documented evidence of weapons shipments to 6 different countries, signed confessions from 3 Border Patrol commanders, bank records showing payments to 28 federal officers. Surrender now! James watched the last of Richard's confidence crumble. His men were already lowering their weapons, professional operators recognizing when a position was truly lost. Even Ramirez had stopped struggling, the fight draining from him as he realized the true scale of what was happening. Your choice is simple, James said, his voice carrying that quiet authority that had once made cartel soldiers surrender rather than face his K9 units. Surrender now. Provide evidence against your entire network. Face justice in a federal court. Or he smiled, the expression sending chills through the room. Well, I haven't had a proper K9 operation in 5 years. Might be fun to see if the legend still holds. Through the resort's windows, the rising sun painted the desert in brilliant gold, nature's spotlight illuminating the final act of a play 5 years in the making. James had positioned every piece perfectly, orchestrated every movement, predicted every reaction. The legend of the ghost handler was about to take on new meaning, not just as the deadliest K9 handler in federal service, but as the architect of the most elaborate sting operation in border history. Richard stared at him for a long moment, weighing options that were rapidly disappearing. Outside, K9 teams and federal investigators arrived by the minute. The net was closing, the trap was sprung, and the legend of the ghost handler was about to remind everyone why some reputations never fade. Richards's military training asserted itself in crisis. Even as his operation crumbled, he maintained the bearing of a commanding officer. "Lieutenant," he ordered, voice steady, "initiate contingency protocol, authorization code Sierra 7. James's grip tightened slightly on Ramirez as he watched. Richards's men respond. Their movements confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't just another fallback plan. Sierra 7 meant something specific, something that made the professional operators exchange knowing glances. "I wouldn't," he said quietly. "Those explosives you had planted around the resort perimeter, already disabled. Amazing how helpful Marine Corps engineers can be when they learn they're supporting treason." Richards' composed facade cracked slightly. "How did you—" "The same way I knew about the ammunition. The same way I knew about the Border Patrol patrols." James's voice carried absolute certainty. 5 years gives you time to learn every protocol, every contingency, every secret weakness in your operation. Through the resort's windows, the rising sun illuminated new movements. Marine Corps K-9 units were arriving, their uniforms marking them as teams from Camp Pendleton. But these weren't Richards's compromised operators. These were fresh units commanded by handlers James had personally trained. "Sir!" Richards's communications officer approached with another radio transcript. "Word from Washington. Federal intelligence is moving on our contacts in the Pentagon. They're seizing documents, making arrests." "The ripples spread, Colonel," James said softly. "Right now, every corrupt official who helped bury Durango is facing their own sunrise surprise. Agency directors, politicians, bank officers, all of them discovering that their carefully hidden secrets aren't so hidden anymore." McGraw struggled briefly in his grip. "You're insane. You'll tear apart the entire border security apparatus." "No," James's voice was steel. "I'm tearing apart the corruption that's rotted border security from the inside. The weapons trafficking, the bought officers, the murdered witnesses, all of it exposed to the light." Outside, Mitchell's voice carried clear authority. "Colonel Richards, Federal Intelligence has seized your records from Station 211. We have documented evidence of 23 murders, 8 commanders paid to dismiss cases, and weapons shipments to 4 different countries. There's nowhere left to run." James watched Richards process this information, noting how his military bearings subtly shifted. She recognized the look. A commander realizing his position was truly lost. But cornered officers were often the most dangerous. "Lieutenant," Richards's voice was too calm. "Implement Black Star Protocol." The effect was immediate. Most of Richards's men paled, several taking involuntary steps back. Only his most hardened operators maintained their positions. James noted their reactions, confirming another suspicion. "Black Star," he said quietly. "Your scorched earth contingency. Destroy everything, eliminate all witnesses, ensure no evidence survives." His smile was cold. "Just like you tried in Durango." Rodriguez moved slightly away from his former comrades. "Sir, those are American operators out there. We can and we will," Richards snapped. "This operation is bigger than any of us. The consequences, if it's exposed, are already happening," James interrupted. "While we've been talking, Federal Intelligence has been executing simultaneous raids across 3 states. Your hidden caches, your secret documents, your banking records, all of it secured." As if confirming his words, new sounds emerged from outside: vehicle engines, boots on gravel, the distinctive sound of K-9 teams moving into position. Through the windows, they could see federal transport vehicles arriving, loaded with familiar crates. "You're missing artillery shipments," James explained. "The ones that disappeared from your secured warehouses last week. They're being catalogued as evidence right now, along with complete documentation of their intended buyers." Richards's face showed real fear for the first time. "Impossible. Those warehouses were under constant guard by operators loyal to their oath, not to your gold." James's voice carried quiet satisfaction. "Amazing how many honest officers have been watching, waiting for a chance to expose the corruption." In their ranks, the resort erupted in new tension as Richards's remaining loyal men took defensive positions. But James noted how many others were slowly backing away, professional operators, recognizing a lost cause. "One last chance, Colonel," he said calmly. "Surrender now. Provide evidence against your entire network. Face military justice, or..." He adjusted his grip on Ramirez, making the cartel leader wince. "Well, they still tell stories about what happened. To the last bunch of corrupt officers who pushed me into a K9 operation. Through the resort's high windows, dawn painted the desert in stark relief, light and shadow, much like the choice now facing every man in the room. Richards's operation was exposed, his carefully constructed network of corruption unraveling by the minute. But James knew from experience that men like him rarely surrendered quietly. "Sir," his lieutenant reported urgently, "more K9 units arriving. They're setting up attack positions using our own training protocols." "Your own protocols," James added with grim satisfaction. "Quite poetic, really. The same techniques you developed for border operations, now ensuring you can't escape justice." Richard's hand moved slowly toward his holster. "You think you've won? You think exposing this operation changes anything? There will always be men willing to profit from chaos, to sell weapons to both sides of any conflict." "Of course there will," James interrupted. "But after today, they'll remember what happened to your operation. They'll remember that even the most powerful conspiracies can fall, that even the highest-ranked officers can face justice." His smile was predatory. "They'll remember the legend of the ghost handler, and they'll think twice." The resort's atmosphere crackled with tension as Richard's men processed their situation. Professional operators recognized when a position was truly lost, when further resistance meant destruction rather than escape. But some men would rather face destruction than confession. "Lieutenant," Richards' voice carried desperate command, "implement final strike protocol, authorization code Alamo 3. The effect was electric. Most of his remaining men blanched, several actually backing away. James noted their reactions. Final strike was clearly something they'd hoped never to hear. "Don't," he said quietly. "Those artillery pieces you had hidden beneath the resort floor, already secured, the ammunition caches in the maintenance tunnels, removed last night, the charges planted along the perimeter, disarmed." His voice carried absolute certainty. "I told you, Colonel. I chose this location very carefully." Through the resort's ancient windows, dawn painted the desert in stark relief. Federal investigators were deploying in practiced formations, securing every approach. More telling were the civilian witnesses arriving, news reporters, federal prosecutors, respected border state officials who would ensure this day's events couldn't be buried or denied. 5 years of planning, James continued softly. Every detail considered, every contingency prepared for, every escape route blocked. This isn't just an arrest, Colonel. This is history being written, justice being served, truth finally emerging from shadows. Richards's hands strayed toward his holster one final time, but James's voice stopped him. "Think carefully, Colonel. Is this how you want your story to end? Another corrupt officer dying rather than facing justice? Or do you want to do one right? The thing? Help expose the full scope of this conspiracy, maybe save some small piece of your honor?" The resort fell silent as morning light streamed through its windows. Every man there faced the same choice, between resistance and surrender, between destruction and redemption, between dying with lies or living with truth. James had orchestrated this moment perfectly, ensuring that justice would finally prevail over power, that righteousness would at last outweigh gold. Outside, Mitchell's voice carried clear authority. "Colonel Richards, the transport vehicles are loaded. The evidence is secured. There's nowhere left to run, no one left to bribe, no shadows left to hide in. Make your choice." The legend of the ghost handler was about to add its final chapter, and every man in that resort knew they were witnessing history being forged in the crucible of justice. The resort's air conditioning hummed softly as morning. Light spilled through the high windows, illuminating the tableau within. James maintained his position, still using Ramirez as a shield while watching Richards's remaining loyal officers assess their increasingly desperate situation. The sound of approaching helicopters announced new arrivals. Not military this time, but media. News teams gathering to observe justice being served. Judge Reeves has arrived from Phoenix, Mitchell's voice carried through the morning air, along with federal prosecutors and news correspondents from 3 states. Everything that happens here today will be documented, Colonel. Every confession, every piece of evidence, every name revealed. James watched Richards process this information, noting how his military bearings subtly changed. The arrival of Judge Reeves, known throughout the border states as the Iron Judge, added new weight to their situation. Reeves was famous not just for his harsh sentences, but for his absolute incorruptibility. An interesting choice, Richards said quietly, his voice carrying that dangerous calm again. Reeves is known for executing corrupt officers who abuse their position. Is that what you're planning, Martinez? A public spectacle? A show trial? No, Colonel. James's voice was steel, wrapped in silk. I'm planning justice, the kind that can't be buried, bribed, or forgotten. Every piece of evidence I've gathered, every witness statement I've collected, every financial record I've traced, all of it will be presented in open court under the eyes of the press and public. Through the resort's windows, they could see more civilians arriving. News teams were setting up mobile broadcast units, ensuring that today's events would be reported across the nation. Federal prosecutors prepared their evidence, ready to document a story that would shake the border security apparatus to its foundations. Sir, Richards's lieutenant spoke urgently. The former commander of Station 211 has arrived under guard. He's already talking to the prosecutors. The dominoes continue to fall, James observed calmly. Amazing how quickly men of power become cooperative when facing federal charges. Your station commander is probably sharing some very interesting stories about those weapons shipments right now. Ramirez struggled briefly in his grip. You're destroying everything. The whole system will collapse. Not the whole system, James. Corrected. Just the corrupt parts, the parts that profit from death and chaos, that turn federal authority into criminal enterprise. His voice hardened. The parts that murder honest officers and bury them in desert graves. Richards's hand moved slightly toward his holster, but James's next words froze him. Those officers you killed, one of them was my partner. He was investigating weapons shipments, following a trail that led right to your operation. His death was listed as a border violence incident. His evidence disappeared. His investigation buried. The resort fell silent as his words sank in. Every man. They suddenly understood the personal motivation behind James's 5-year quest. This wasn't just about justice. It was about vengeance, served cold and calculated. Lieutenant, Richards's voice carried desperate command. Signal the backup units. Authorization Phoenix Red. They won't come, James said quietly. Those loyal units you positioned in the hills. They've been surrounded for hours. Mitchell made sure of that before dawn. Even if they wanted to help, they're rather busy explaining to federal investigators why they're carrying unauthorized artillery shells. Through the windows, they could see more official vehicles arriving. Federal investigators were methodically documenting everything, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence. More importantly, they were positioning themselves with tactical precision, ready for any attempted breakout. 5 years, James continued softly. 5 years of watching, waiting, gathering evidence, building a case so strong that not even your political connections could bury it. And you walked right into it exactly as I planned. Richard's military composure cracked further. You used your own partner's death as bait? Set this whole trap knowing we'd try to silence you like we silenced him? I used the truth as bait, James corrected. Knew that men like you can't resist trying to bury it one more time, can't stand the thought of your crimes being exposed, your power being stripped away, your names being dragged into the light. The resort's atmosphere crackled with tension as Richards's remaining men realized the full scope of their situation. Professional operators recognized when a position was truly lost, when further resistance meant destruction rather than escape. But some men would rather face destruction than confession. Outside, Mitchell's voice carried clear authority. "Colonel Richards, Judge Reeves is prepared to hear preliminary testimony. Any operator who cooperates now will be shown consideration during sentencing. This is your final opportunity for leniency." James watched the impact of these words ripple through the room. Every man there knew Reeves's reputation, harsh but fair, willing to show mercy to those who helped expose corruption, but utterly merciless to those who continued to resist justice. "Your choice gets simpler by the second, Colonel," he said quietly. "Surrender now, provide evidence against the entire network, face justice with some shred of honor intact, or..." His smile was cold as desert frost. "Find out if the legends about the ghost handler are true. Either way, this all ends today." Morning light streamed through the resort's windows, illuminating men who had to choose between surrender and destruction, between confession and legacy, between dying with lies or living with truth. James had orchestrated this moment perfectly, ensuring that justice would finally prevail over power, that righteousness would at last outweigh gold. The resort erupted in chaos as Richards finally made his desperate move. "Now!" he shouted, and hidden panels in the resort walls burst open. A dozen more men emerged, wearing federal tactical gear, the same units that were supposed to be arresting them. James had been waiting for this. Even as Richards's hidden reinforcements appeared, Mitchell's voice cut through the morning air. "Second team, move in. They're using the maintenance tunnels." Through the resort's windows, James could see more K-9 teams emerging from concealed positions, cutting off the new arrivals. He had known about Richards's secret forces all along, had counted on them in fact. Every seemingly successful contingency plan only drew more of his conspirators into his trap. "Impressive," James acknowledged, maintaining his hold on Ramirez, while assessing the new tactical situation. "Using falsified federal credentials to position backup teams. The same trick you used in Durango." His smile was predatory. "Did you really think I wouldn't remember, wouldn't plan for it?" Richard's face showed real fear now, as he realized even his ultimate contingency had been anticipated. "How did you..." "The same way I knew about the resort's maintenance tunnels. The same way I knew about your false credentials, Colonel." James's voice carried quiet satisfaction. 5 years gives you time to learn every trick, every protocol, every desperate measure. I needed you to think you had options, needed you to call in every resource, activate every ally. Through the windows, they could see the false federal agents being disarmed and arrested by the real ones. More importantly, they were being photographed, their faces and false credentials documented for evidence that couldn't be buried or denied. "Sir," Richards's legitimate lieutenant reported urgently. "Message from Washington. They're arresting the quartermaster who supplied our fake credentials. They found his lists, names, ranks, unit assignments." "The web unravels," James said softly. "Right now, similar scenes are playing out across 3 states. Every false identity exposed, every corrupt official identified, every hidden connection revealed. You didn't just walk into a trap, Colonel. You walked into history." Ramirez's struggle had subsided as he watched his last hopes of escape dissolve. "This was never about just catching us, was it? You used us to expose everything." Finally figuring it out, James's voice held strange gentleness. "This operation was too big, too well protected to attack directly. I needed to let it think it was winning, needed to give it rope to hang itself. Every contingency you activated, every backup plan you implemented, every ally you called on, all of them documented, photographed, recorded as evidence. Through the resort's ancient windows, dawn painted the desert in stark relief. Federal investigators were processing the growing number of prisoners, carefully documenting each false credential, each hidden connection, each piece of evidence that would expose the true scope of the conspiracy. The correspondents are starting there. "Stories," Mitchell called out. "News teams are sending initial reports. By sunset, every newspaper from Texas to California will be reporting on the biggest border corruption scandal since 9/11. James watched Richards process this information, noting how his military bearing finally crumbled completely. The arrival of the press, the presence of news cameras, the careful documentation of evidence, all of it ensured that this couldn't be buried like Durango. "You don't understand what you've done," Richards whispered. "The chaos when this becomes public, the damage to border security's reputation. I understand perfectly," James's voice was steel. "I understand that border security's reputation is stained worse by covering up corruption than by exposing it. That real honor comes from facing hard truths, not burying them." A new commotion drew their attention. Through the resort doors came a figure James hadn't seen in 5 years. Captain Mike Anderson, the partner who had survived Durango, who had been forced to retire after trying to investigate the weapons trafficking. "Hello, Colonel." Anderson's voice carried the weight of long-awaited justice. "Been a while since Durango. James told me you might need some questioning today." The impact of Anderson's arrival rippled through the room. Every corrupt officer there recognized him, the legendary handler who had nearly exposed their operation 5 years ago, who had been silenced through political pressure and false accusations. "You see, Colonel," James said quietly, "today isn't just about exposing current crimes. It's about correcting old injustices, clearing names that were falsely smeared, revealing truths that were buried in desert graves." Morning light streamed through resort windows, illuminating a scene that would be recorded in history books and newspaper headlines. James had orchestrated every detail perfectly. The evidence, the witnesses, the official documentation that would ensure this day's events could never be denied or buried. "Your last chance, Colonel," he said softly. "Surrender now. Provide evidence against the entire network. Help us expose every corrupt official and false identity." Or, his smile was cold as desert frost, "find out if the legends about what happened at Black Sand were understated." The resort fell silent as Richards faced his final choice. Professional operators recognized when a position was truly lost, when further resistance meant not just defeat, but historical infamy. The legend of the ghost handler was about to add its most significant chapter, and every man there knew they were witnessing justice that would echo through generations. Anderson's arrival transformed the atmosphere in the old resort. His presence carried the weight of history, a living reminder of the corruption James had spent 5 years working to expose. Anderson moved with the measured pace of a man who had waited nearly a decade for this moment, his eyes never leaving Richards as he approached. "You know what's interesting, Colonel?" Anderson's voice carried quiet authority. 5 years ago, when I was investigating those murdered officers, I had a theory. Told it to James's partner the day before he died. Said I believed someone in Federal Command was running a massive weapons trafficking operation, using their authority to cover up crimes, eliminate witnesses, bury evidence. James watched Richards's face as Anderson spoke, noting how the colonel's composure cracked further with each word. Through the resort's windows, more federal investigators arrived, accompanied by DEA agents and state law enforcement. The net was drawing tighter by the minute. The really interesting part, Anderson continued, was the pattern. Every time we got close to exposing the operation, key witnesses would disappear, important evidence would vanish, investigating officers would be transferred or forced to retire, almost like someone had access to our investigation files, knew our moves before we made them. Because they did. James's voice cut through the tension. They had a source inside federal intelligence, someone who could warn them about investigations, help them create false identities, provide them with classified information. His smile was cold. Isn't that right, Agent Miller? Richard's communications. Officer went pale as every eye in the room turned to him. James had saved this revelation for precisely this moment, knowing its impact would shatter what remained of Richard's organization. 5 years, James continued quietly. 5 years I spent tracking the real source of the corruption. It wasn't just about weapons trafficking or murdered officers. The operation went deeper, all the way into federal intelligence itself. Miller helped bury the Durango investigation, helped create those false credentials, helped eliminate witnesses who got too close. Miller's hand dropped to his holster, but James's voice stopped him. I wouldn't. Those rounds in your revolver, changed them myself last night. Amazing how many people in your own organization were willing to help once they learned the truth about those murdered officers. Through the resort's windows, they could see more officials arriving. Judge Reeves had set up a temporary court in the resort's conference center, already beginning to take testimony from arrested conspirators. More importantly, federal investigators were photographing and documenting everything, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence. Your choice gets simpler by the second, Agent Miller, James said calmly. We already have your records, your correspondence with Richards, your orders for eliminating witnesses. The only question is whether you face justice with some shred of honor intact or... He let the threat hang in the desert air. Anderson moved closer, his voice carrying decades of experience. Think carefully, son. I've seen what happens when the ghost handler's patience runs out. There's a reason they still tell stories about Operation Black Sand. The resort fell silent as his words sank in. Miller's betrayal had been the key to the entire operation, the weakness James had spent years exploiting. Through him, James had accessed the inner workings of the conspiracy, gathered evidence that couldn't be denied, and positioned himself for this final confrontation. 1 month after the events at the Desert Springs Resort, James Martinez stood on his farm's porch, watching the Arizona sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Vista Ridge Farm had returned to its quiet routine, though changes were visible to those who knew where to look. New federal patrol routes stretched across the horizon, their commanders carefully vetted and monitored. More importantly, the border region had begun to heal, freed from the cancer of corruption that had haunted it for so long. More reports from Judge Reeves's court, Rachel said, joining him with coffee. They're still uncovering connections, still making arrests. 5 more officers convicted yesterday, 3 commanders removed from service. The ripples keep spreading. James accepted the coffee, noting how his daughter's bearing had changed since that day. The weight of their secret had lifted, replaced by quiet pride in what they'd accomplished. They'll keep spreading for years, he replied softly. Corruption like that runs deep, takes time to burn it all out. Through the evening air came the sound of approaching vehicles. Not the threatening rumble of cartel SUVs this time, but the disciplined rhythm of federal units. Anderson emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by Mitchell and other familiar faces from the operation. Each carried documents requiring the legend's insight. Sorry to interrupt your retirement again, Anderson said as they reached the porch, but we need your expertise. Federal intelligence found more of Miller's files, more false identities we need to track down. James nodded toward the house. They moved inside, spreading materials across the kitchen table that had once hosted family dinners. Now, it served as an impromptu command center for coordinating the ongoing cleanup of Richards's network. 3 more weapons caches discovered near Station 211, Mitchell reported, displaying maps marked with careful annotations. Each one connected to officers we didn't know were involved. The conspiracy went deeper than anyone imagined. Not deeper than I imagined, James observed calmly, studying the evidence. Years of watching, waiting, gathering intelligence. I knew we'd find routes like this once we started digging. He traced a line on the map connecting multiple border stations. These aren't just random caches. They're part of a supply line that stretches all the way to Mexico. In their kennels, Shadow, Storm, and Scout rested peacefully, their mission accomplished. But like their handler, they remained ready, waiting for the next time justice needed the Ghost Handler's special touch. The legend of the Ghost Handler had evolved into something more profound than tales of canine operations and impossible takedowns. It had become a testament to the enduring power of justice, truth, and the patience to see them both prevail. The sun set on another quiet evening at Vista Ridge Farm, casting long shadows across the land James Martinez had fought so hard to protect. Some legends never truly retire. They just wait in the shadows, ready to remind the world that no one stands above the law. You won't want to miss our next thrilling story coming right up tomorrow. If this one hit home, make sure you're subscribed and tap that notification bell. Every like and comment helps us keep bringing these incredible true stories of justice and redemption to you. Check out 2 more must-watch tales appearing on your screen right now. If you enjoyed the Ghost Handler's legend, these are right up your alley. Thanks for being part of our storytelling community. See you in the next video.